From Fairfax, Virginia, this is Out of the Past with Chuck Langdon and Lee Shephard, an in-depth discussion with some of the most fascinating people of our time, many of them with strong area connections. Now, today's Out of the Past.
Hello and welcome to Out of the Past. I'm Chuck Langdon with co-host Lee Shephard.
Thank you, Chuck. We have for the second time, although the first time was about 2 years ago, I think, a wonderful storyteller, one of the best storytellers in the Washington, D.C. area, Ellouise Schoettler, who is, I said, one of the best storytellers in the area. Now, 2 years later, I can say she is perhaps one of the best storytellers in the nation. That's since she was anointed, I think that's the right word, for the Storyteller Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee. That's the Super Bowl for storytellers. Did I get that right, Ellouise?
A little bit. I'll take what you said.
All right. Now, in all fairness, I think we should tell the audience that, first of all, we've known each other since we were about 5 years old.
That's true.
I have been blessed in my life, for some reason, to be at places like the movie Being There. You know, the guy's just there and things happen. I'm just there and meet the greatest people, and some of them have become very famous. And we'll be talking about some of them today because I think we both know them. But let's get back to storytelling, which is our main subject. Perhaps I have a theory that television is responsible for professional storytellers like yourself, because everybody's been telling stories, just about everybody, all their lives, until it never became a big deal or a professional, or with all these festivals, until the advent of television, when people stopped talking to each other. That's my theory. Tell me I'm wrong.
I think it has something to do with it. I think there's been a renaissance in storytelling that for years and years, librarians kept storytelling alive in this country for children in the library. And in about the 70s, the mid-70s, they began to have, and it did start in Jonesboro, Tennessee, gatherings of storytellers, and then they fanned out to other parts of the country, and you have the advent of these large festivals. Unfortunately, for those of us who tell storytelling stories for adults, because that's what I do, and that's what happens in Jonesboro, you're not sitting in a rocking chair, you know, although you may have white hair, you're not sitting in a rocking chair telling for little children. You're telling for adults, actually. But people still have that concept of the storyteller being primarily for children. They have forgotten that Shakespeare was a storyteller. The bard was always in the story. You know, that history was carried from place to place or castle to castle, you know, by storytellers who traveled and who carried. In Africa, the griot is known as the one who has the history of the tribe or the history of the village, and they train the griot that's going to follow them. You know, so we've lost some of that in this country. That's where I think you're talking about. I learned my stories, as you probably did, maybe you did too, Chuck, sitting with my grandmother and my aunts in Charlotte, North Carolina, on the porch or around the dining room table, and as a kid I was listening. You know, and that's how I picked up my family history, was through the people who were telling. In my case, in my family, they loved to talk about each other. And so they talked endlessly about themselves and each other. And I think that we lost that when we stopped having dinner together.
Yes, you know, you're hard to put in a box, like many people, but right. Particularly you were a nurse.
I'm a nurse dropout.
A nurse dropout. Then you were always an actress, because I remember in junior high school, and you were always in every play.
I'd like to be.
And when you used to have to put powder on your hair to get it white.
Right.
Now, I love that look, the all white look. I don't have it.
But see, I don't even have to use powder anymore.
But how did you get into storytelling? You were an artist, are an artist.
I am an artist, and in the 80s, sort of infected by some questions, I'll tell you how I got into it. I went to Germany, my husband and I went to Germany, and we found the little town that his family came from. And he was doing some genealogy searching, and it was way back in the mountains, Appalachia of Germany. And we found that family, and we're talking to those that were still there. There was an 80-some-year-old man who was a dead ringer for his grandfather. There was the younger son of a younger son of a younger son who was the same level on the tree as Jim, but younger. And my son was with us, and Jim, and they were sitting there talking. And I looked at them, and they all had the same hands. It was an electric moment. They had the same hands, and I wanted to know that in my family. So I came back and started searching. And last year, I did a show at the Capitol Fringe in Washington called Finding Gus. My mother's father died when she was 18, and my grandmother, she was 18 months old, let's put it like that, not 18 months old. And my grandmother grieved so hard for him, a love of her life and whatever, that he got lost to our family because all we knew was a headstone in Elmwood Cemetery. And I went looking for Gus. Well, I found a wonderful thing. He was from Anderson, South Carolina. I went down and met his last living sibling who was approaching 90. And I discovered that Gus had played football at Clemson for Heisman, and then had played in one of the first pre-Orange Bowl games, and Heisman paid him $50. And he lost his scholarship. He was a farm boy, one of 11, and he lost his scholarship, and he couldn't go to college until North Carolina State, not being quite as picky as Clemson, who said he'd lost his amateur standing, recruited him to come and play for State. And the write-ups in the 1910 State album of Gus Schoettler were just fascinating. They were just fascinating. And I met a young cousin who's a sports professional, what do they call it, a communicator. He's in the box and he talks on the radio and everything about Clemson sports. He knew all about Gus. And I went down to meet him. And a man who was only a dead man to me in our family, he gave me back as a folk hero. And when they rebuilt the Clemson Stadium, Sam Blackman is his name, bought a brick for the athletes. They were, as a fundraiser, they were selling those bricks. And he said, come down here. And we went to the stadium, and we're both standing there with tears in our eyes and said, he's the earliest one. Gus Schoettler, he'll never leave here.
Amazing.
That's what storytelling and family history can put together, if you can find those stories and tell them. Now my children are absolutely ecstatic. My son is obviously an adult businessman, and he's ecstatic that his great-grandfather played under Heisman.
Now, are your stories about real people, real places, and time?
Most always. Most always. Mm-hmm.
They're not made-up stories.
Sometimes I tell folk tales.
Folk tales.
Yeah, or sometimes I don't really tell many tall tales. I came to storytelling professionally 20 years ago, or plus or minus a few years, and my purpose was to really tell the stories from my family. And because I wanted them for my children, I wanted them for me. And I wanted to find them. And I think it's incredibly important to do what we used to do at the dining room table, is to let your family know who they are with what you know about yourself and about who you came from. So basically, some of my people sound like I make them up, but they didn't. They were really that crazy.
Speaking of those authors from Charlotte, Jan Karen, she was in junior high school with us.
Piedmont Junior High School.
Yes, she was. And she was one of the prettiest girls.
I don't remember that part.
Well, I do. Although she was so pretty, I was kind of intimidated.
I don't remember that. I was too jealous, probably. I don't remember that at all.
But she was there, and let me see, there's somebody else. Well, Harry Golden.
Right.
Now, he wasn't from Charlotte, but he wasn't.
What was the name of that paper?
The Carolina Israelite.
Carolina Israelite, and it was just right down it was his office was right down Elizabeth Avenue from the school, wasn't it?
Yes, and on Elizabeth Avenue, and he what I was going to say, I had an old man moment there, but it was like a blog, except before blogs, of course,
exactly.
were there. But this was in the 50s. It was a one-man newspaper. He was the advertising man. He did everything, wrote all the stories. And he used to say, I asked him one time, I said, Harry, how do you remember all these old stories you tell? He said, well, whenever a thought comes to my mind about a story, I'll write it down and then put it in the barrel. And he had a barrel right beside his desk. And whenever I get ready to publish the paper, I just reach in the barrel and find some story that I put in my barrel.
Wow.
And so that may be the secret. I'm going to get me a barrel.
Well, I would if I... But, you know, the other place that I found some interesting stories in Charlotte is at Elmwood Cemetery. And I like to go to... Well, I didn't like to go to cemeteries. Of course, I was raised going to a cemetery with my grandmother. Do you want to go out and see your granddaddy? And so, you know, we'd go out there and sit. She'd look at that stone, and I just putz around. But when you do genealogy, you become familiar with graveyards because that's where you're looking for the people. And I started going back to Elmwood. Do you want me to tell you a quick story about Elmwood Cemetery?
Yes.
People just aren't aware. You know, they don't go to cemeteries much anymore. You know, I have people say, well, you know, I don't go to the cemetery. And I think, you know, that's too bad. They're really missing a lot. So at any rate, in Charlotte, right inside the gate of Elmwood Cemetery, there is an obelisk. And there is a relief sculpture on that obelisk of an elephant. And that was pointed out to me when I was a child, and my mother always said, or my grandmother, that's the Elephant Man. Well, I never knew a story about that until I was looking for some information on my father's great-grandfather. His name was Walter Cobb, and he came to Charlotte in the 1800s. His father died in South Carolina. They moved back there. Anyway, I started reading the newspapers to try to figure out what was life like, what might have been happening. Could I find out something that would give me at least a little interest in that period of time, and I could incorporate it into a story about this man whom I knew nothing about? Well, I discovered that in 1880, the circus was coming to town. And everybody was all excited. They started advertising and telling about it for 3 months before, and then they would keep telling, and they told about who was going to be on the high wire and what, and they were going to bring this great elephant chief. And that was a big attraction all up and down the East Coast. And the morning that the circus came in, they were all up early, and they were down at the train tracks to have the train come in about dawn. And so it came in not too far from St. Peter's Catholic Church, which was my church. And so they opened up the train car, slid open the door, and Chief came to the door, raised his trunk, you know, and the people started surging forward, Chief, Chief. And the John King, who was the trainer, held up his stick and tried to push him back. Don't come too close, don't come too close. And they kept on, and Chief stepped out onto the gangplank that was going to take him down out of the train, and as he did, somebody reached up toward him and he threw up his trunk, and when he did, he picked up John King and slammed him up against the red brick building across the street, and John King fell down just like a rag doll in the street. Some men rushed forward, and this is a true story written in the Charlotte Observer, picked him up. They took him into this barber shop, and they put a board across the chair, stretched him out. He was dead. They called Dr. O'Donoghue. He was gone. Well, they still had a show to do that afternoon, and they were on a schedule. So they laid him out in the fanciest coffin that they could find in St. Peter's Catholic Church. And they went out, they did their show, you know, and they had Mr. Lolo the clown was there, and they had Miss Violetta was up on the high wire. They had the white horses. And that afternoon, in their costumes, sweaty and stinking. They all came back to the church where the candles had been burning, and it smells like beeswax and flowers. And they did a Catholic burial for this Catholic man. And outside, they had the calliope, and they had the horses were pulling that casket on the back of a truck, and they went out, dirt roads and everything, to Elmwood Cemetery, and they buried him. John Walter Cobb was probably one of the young guys that was serving Mass that day. And that's how I connected my great-grandfather to that story. And the real story is that circus was just pure P.T. Barnum, because the next year they came back to Charlotte and they put up that obelisk, not with John King's name on it, but with the big elephant chief engraved on the obelisk, chief, and the name of the circus. And every year when they came to town, they went out to Elmwood and they had a little memorial service for John King. But it was all advertising.